And for those of you that are in fields where you are planning to be involved in nonprofit management, you'll find that what I'm covering today is just the tip of the iceberg. There's an awful lot to it that people have with a lot more skills than I could really teach you. So we are going to cover the highlights so that you can make sense of other people's budgets, but building one of your own could still be a skill that needs some practice. So let's go ahead and get to it. Okay, so I want to cover a couple of questions that have to do with terms. And as you can tell from the screen, I can't see you. So if you have a question, please just interrupt me and I'll do my best to pivot. So we're going to talk about who prepares a project budget, some things about direct or indirect costs, which may be new terms to you, and yet they come up all the time. We want to talk about common categories of expenses when you are developing programs that you're trying to fund with grants. And then we're going to talk about some calculations. How do you figure out how much your project costs each year or how much it will cost across the entire project period? I'll also share with you that when we create a budget, which I want you to think of that as like a spreadsheet, the budget itself is the numbers. We also create a narrative, which is the budget justification. And that is where for every expense that we specify on our spreadsheet, we're going to have a couple lines of text that explain why we need that expense. And when people are reviewing your grants, they're first going to read your aims, your objectives, your work plan, what it is you want to accomplish. Then they're going to look at your budget and they're going to ask themselves, has this team planned for all of the things they need to include in their project? Have they really thought through all of the costs? They're also going to ask themselves, is this budget reasonable for the scope of the product that somebody will provide? So for example, last week I was on an NIH grant review for 2 days, and we had a project that came in with a budget of $5.5 million, and yet it was only going to impact about 100 people. So that was a time when the payoff, in a sense, the benefit of the project was not going to be sufficient to justify that amount of money. So that particular grant was rejected, not because it wasn't a good project, but because it wasn't budgeted in a way that was affordable. So budgeting is all about financial accountability. So when we think about who's preparing a budget, the person who's leading the project, the person whose name is going in as the submitter of the grant, that person is, it turns out, ethically and legally responsible to manage the budget well. So that person in a research context is referred to as a principal investigator or a PI. And in the community sector, it's either a project director, somebody just in charge of that particular grant funded project, or it could be the executive director or the leader of the entire organization. But somebody who's involved on the substance end of what the agency does takes the lead. And while the money in a funded grant goes to the agency of the organization, right? It's not like the money goes into the bank account of any of these people. It goes to the organization. The people who are signing all the paperwork to manage the funds are legally responsible to do that correctly. And so in that role, you will want to be very careful to read the entire section on the budget guidance for the grants you are applying for. There are certain times where expenses are not allowed under certain grants. And if you were to not follow the rules, you as a leader of the project could be held responsible. Now, it's also good to know that that substantive person isn't expected to be the world's best accountant or to be able to understand even how to work with spreadsheets in a really sophisticated way. We count on our colleagues in accountancy or the finance professions to be the ones to work with us to create the budget. So for me, in a university context, I will figure out, I want to go for this grant. Then I will sit with my team and we'll figure out in general, what are the things we want to do? What are our activities? What kinds of expenses will I have? And then immediately, I will set up an appointment with our financial person on campus because I want to get her started on putting all the numbers together while the team and I work on the text of the grant. So you want to work with your financial person very early in the evolution of the project. You can always add expenses or take them away, but there are administrative deadlines that often have to be met, both within your own organization as well as in the potential funders organization. So you want to bring those financial people on board. As you're preparing the budget, you want to make sure you always make changes if you've changed your activities. Now, just about any budget that I've seen in a university or nonprofit context uses these terms, direct and indirect costs. So I want to take a moment to explain what that means. Direct costs are the actual expenses for the project itself. So this includes all the money that you're paying your people, it's all the salaries, it's all the equipment. And equipment in grantsmanship is defined as anything that will last beyond the grant period. So it's things like computers or printers, things that are potentially expensive for at one point in time, but then you use across the time period. If you used eye tracking equipment or an MRI, that would go there. Supplies are also a direct cost, but they are things that are thought to be consumed. So things like manuals for treatments or worksheets or measures. So direct costs include all the expenses to do the project itself. Once again, you want to check the grant guidance to make sure that the expenses that you've budgeted are allowable. So without getting too far into the weeds, one example would be federal grants don't let you pay for postage or mailing under direct costs. Instead, federal grants expect that the organization that you are working for, whether that's a university or a nonprofit, has postage and is going to use some of the next category of expenses, indirects, to cover those kinds of what we might consider infrastructure costs. So indirect costs are additional costs to the funder that cover the infrastructure of the organization that's asking for money. Now, not every funder allows indirect costs, but the federal government does, and most state grants do. So, for example, a federal grant from NIH comes with an indirect rate of 50%. So what that means is if NIH says, we have this RO3 grant, small research grant, we will give you $100,000 a year for 2 years of direct costs if you win this grant. On top of that, we will take 50% of our direct cost amount, which would be in this case $50,000, and we'll give it to your university to cover your heating, you're in a building, you've got postage and printing and all of these infrastructure costs. So that's how universities like CSU benefit from grants. They don't, in a sense, profit from the direct costs because that's money spent to meet the goals of the project. But indirect costs are what enable a university to have a grants office, to have sponsored programs, to have an institutional review board for ethics. Now, not every funder, as I mentioned, will cover indirects. Many foundations will say no indirects included. And so that's a time when you'll need to ask the leadership in your organization, I'd like to apply for this grant. It's not going to give us any extra money. Can I still have your permission to do it? So indirects kind of keep your organization going and are often critical to the survival of the organization. And so you may have to make sure you're going for more than one grant if you can't get all of your indirects covered by one. There's one more thing I want you to know about indirects. In public health, there are some agencies that say, we will give you $100,000 a year for 2 years, but that total counts the direct and the indirect expenses. So I had that happen once for a public health project, and I didn't notice that rule. So I developed a budget that would say, allow me to spend $100,000 in direct costs, only to have the accountant tell me, oh, that doesn't work. You can only project 50,000 in direct costs because the other 50,000 are going to go to indirects. So you do need to understand, are there indirect costs? If so, are they added to the total or are they kind of subsumed under the total amount you're allowed to go for? So usually your total costs are direct plus indirect, but there are times when the indirect costs are assumed to be covered under the total.
Hey Susan, there's
Yes.
a question in the chat for you.
Oh, thank you. I definitely need a moderator. Is that more? Let's find out. Chat. Oh, thank you. Ah, many grants don't pay for staff time, only supplies. Have you seen this as well? Oh, that's such a good point. Um, yes, and that's a problem. A lot of the nonprofit foundation grants, those that are smaller in size and easier to obtain, will do things like exclude personnel. And that makes it really hard, especially if what you're really trying to do is keep your people funded. And to me, in my career, that's been the biggest pressure for bringing in grants, is to make sure that everybody on the team has continuity in their salaries. So that's an important thing to pay attention to. And it's okay to go for grants that will cover other costs, but you probably are going to need to find ways to keep your staff funded. Excellent question. So what are some, I'm going to keep the chat up so that I can pay attention, and please shout out like you did if I miss it. What are some of the common categories of expenses? So if any of you have ever used something to manage your personal money, some sort of software like Quicken or QuickBooks, you've noticed that there are kind of budget categories that people are used to using, kind of conventions. Well, in the grantsmanship world, the budget categories can be idiosyncratic, but in general, they include personnel, which is your staffing, and that's usually the largest cost. They include equipment, those one-time purchases of things that you need, supplies, things that are consumed, and that could include things like providing food for a focus group, or oh, you lost me for a bit. Okay, let's see. Uh, Hopefully I haven't said anything too critical. I'm just talking about categories of expenses, personnel being your highest cost, equipment and supplies. And then I was just going to say, if you're running a focus group, for example, under supplies, you would include food that you're providing to members at the focus group. So you really want to think through every aspect of what you're going to do to run your project. Travel expenses are calculated in very specific ways in grants, and it really differs by the grant you're working with, but we usually have to specify, if it's local travel, how many miles do we think we'll drive? And then we usually build in reimbursement at, say, something like 32 cents a mile, whatever the current laws are, and calculate that expense over time. It's also important to consider incentives. So what will you do to help people participate in your project? For example, once we needed to kind of activate local pediatricians to recruit families who had concerns about their children's development. And we didn't initially offer incentives. We just hoped that they would, I guess, do it out of the goodness of their heart. And pediatricians are super busy, no matter how big their hearts are. And I think it wasn't on their radar, and we didn't get many referrals. When we instituted an incentive, which basically was continuing education credit that pediatricians need for their licensure, when we gave them credit for attending a workshop and then incentivized recruiting participants with gift cards, we then had a much better time with recruitment. Now, many of you have experience in using incentives in research projects, and there's all kinds of things to consider. Ethically, you don't want to offer an incentive that is so large that you're coercing someone to do a project that they otherwise wouldn't want to do. So you have to be very careful that ethically you're not putting somebody at risk for like some awful medical procedure. And because that person needs the money, they're willing to compromise their health. So you have to be super careful about keeping your incentives modest. But you also want to be thoughtful about incentives. And in social psychology, for example, we've learned that if you send somebody even like a sticker for their car or a penny, you're more likely to get a contribution back, which is part of why your mailbox is probably full of little free calendars and little refrigerator magnets. The idea being that if someone feels indebted to you, they're more likely to participate. That has some ethical issues to it as well. But if you are using any incentives, you would note them in your grant. And then lastly, you may have what we might call activity specific expenses. So if you're running focus groups, you want to think about, I need big white paper that I can post on the wall. I need magic markers, that kind of thing. Okay, there we go. So how do we calculate our expenses? Well, um, I'm going to have to minimize you guys. Basically, the first thing that you do is you come up with every category that you think you'll need for your project, and then you're going to think through each of those categories 1 year at a time. So most grants cover either 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years. It's very rare they go beyond that. Your budget is going to have a section for each year that you run the project. In your personnel section, and I'm going to show you some examples here in a minute, you basically try to figure out how much of each person's time do you want them to spend on the project. So for example, you may have a project coordinator who's going to run 2 projects as part of her job. So you want her to be 50% time on this project. So you would list her as 50% effort, or in some grants cultures, they convert that effort into a very strange metric called calendar months. So 50% effort across a 12-month year is 6 calendar months. So this is where your accountant person will know the lingo and can help you, but you're basically figuring out how much time will this person spend, and then multiply that percent time by their overall base rate of their salary, not their fringe benefits, but their base rate. And this is another time that your accountant will help you. Then you'll come up with a total for that year. Then separately, you're going to account for what the fringe benefits for that person's salary will add to your costs. And if you are using folks that are in a consultant role, meaning you're paying them a set fee for whatever they're going to do, I'm going to give you $1,200 to help me with this project, you would include that in your personnel plan. And if you have hourly people, you will include the number of hours um, each week for that project year times how much you're paying them. I'll show you an example in a minute. Because personnel costs are our largest of the grant, and because they tend to not be stable, like ideally you hope that your organization can afford to give a cost of living raise to all of the people on your staff, your personnel expenses are probably going to be different for each year of your project. So you would hope that at year 2, you can give raises to your people and you'll be paying more for their time. As we'll discuss, when you're working with your budget, sometimes you have to reduce the number of people on a project to be able to balance things. Sometimes you keep all the people, but you reduce the amount of time you expect them to spend on it. So personnel is a place where you want to plan at the beginning to really make sure you have what you need. Over time, you can spend less, but it's very hard to add money to your personnel field. So you want to make sure you're covering your people before anything else. Next, you would think about for that year of the project, let's say year 1, what equipment do you need? Maybe you need 2 computers and they're $1,200 each. Supplies that you will purchase and ideally use that year are put into the year 1 budget. At year 2, you may have new supplies that you'll put in. Same with incentives, travel, and any other expenses. Let me just check the chat, make sure I haven't missed anything. Okay, good. So as you are working these things out in the budget spreadsheet, you will work to get it so that your budget comes just under the total amount, usually, that the funder is willing to give you if you win the grant. After you have a balanced budget, you will then draft your narrative budget justification. And I'll show you some of these. This is where you explain why you need to spend any money at all for that thing, and then why you are allocating a certain amount if that needs to be justified. There are an awful lot of rules in different grant guidelines about how much detail to go into, and personnel justification is usually the most detailed and takes the most time. If you don't justify a category, you may be in a situation where the funder says, hey, we'd really like to give you this grant, but we won't let you spend money on this, and you can basically decide if that's okay with you. So let's take a look at an example. And this was the biggest reason I wanted to do this in an interactive way. When you get a chance to look at Module 6, you'll see that I have included 3 examples in there. One I'm going to go through right now. There's another one on a pediatrics project, and a third one that's connected to your assignment. So I encourage you to look at the materials, at least for the one we're covering now, possibly the pediatrician one, and then your assignment. Did someone have a question? Okay, I thought maybe I heard. All right, perfect. Let's go here. So I'm choosing for you to go into this educational identification grant. I'm going to use that budget, which I have doctored a bit. So I've taken out anything confidential and tried to make it a teaching example. So it's more of an amalgam, doesn't necessarily reflect reality. Now, a grant reviewer is going to look, as I said, at the aims of the project and make sure that what you're trying to do is reasonable for the amount of money that you're asking. So all you guys need to know about this project is we were asking for funding for 2 years at $100,000 a year to a nonprofit foundation called Autism Speaks to help us try to improve educational identification of students in elementary, middle, and high school who have not been identified as having a developmental disability, but really need to be identified. So Colorado was at a time the third worst in the nation in identifying students for special ed, and we were hoping that we could improve it. So we wanted to collaborate with our State Department of Education to do a couple things. We wanted to create an online course. We wanted to provide some coaching to teams that were working in real cases. And then we wanted to do these telehealth consultations so people could learn from each other. So it's a project that was going to be heavy in personnel costs. This was something we ran out of the med school. So we had 3 professors, you'll see here under personnel, and notice that each person has a line of their own. That's really how spreadsheets work. And the good news is, as a graduate student, I remember looking at postdoc salaries, and I just about doubled my salary from graduate student to postdoc. Life gets better after you graduate. So if you ever are thinking, oh, will I ever make enough money to feel like I can go to a restaurant? I'm not saying this is a ton of money, but it's very exciting to have salaries in these ranges. And this is about average now for assistant professors at universities. So for those of you on the academic track, things can get better financially too. So we have a base salary then of all of our staff people. We have graduate students who are making an hourly wage, and we have some folks within the broader university, media specialist and program administrator that we were including. We needed to report the benefits rate. What that means is that the universities that we worked for pays 29% of our salary goes on top of our salary to benefits. So that has to be calculated when you look over at the right side under the project benefits column. That's what it costs to provide benefits for each of the people on the project. So if Professor 1, who was an associate professor, is going to spend 2.4 calendar months. So if we think of 12 calendar months, that's about 20% time. So that's another way to look at it. Project time is 20%. How did I get to that? Well, the federal government assumes that you work a 40-hour week. They therefore assume that 1 day of effort is 20% time. So it is pretty common for leaders of multiple grants to have 1 day of effort on each project because they do other things throughout their week. If the PI, the leader of the project, was asking for less than 20% time, they were going to say, hey, I'm going to spend less than 1 day on this relatively large project, that would not be credible and people would flag it. So you want your lead person to be paid enough to really put in some good leadership and time on the project. You can then see that there are other people that are going to be spending less time on the project, and nobody is full-time on the project. With a $100,000 budget, even though that seems like such a lot of money, that money goes really quickly, and you end up in most grants funding several people just a little. In fact, one of the ways that our team continued to function is that we were frequently submitting grants and including each other on those projects so that we could all stay afloat and stay employed. So as you are calculating your personnel costs, you take into account the person's salary, timed how much time they're spent, and then you add in the benefits, and that's where you get your year one totals over here. So far, our personnel costs are probably going to be almost $65,000 for this project. So what else do we need? Well, we do need a little bit of national travel because we had to go to meetings that the funder required. And we also needed local travel to do our initial trainings around the state. So we don't have to show them all the math in this budget, but in a budget justification, we probably go into more detail. And then you can see the kinds of supplies that we anticipate. And you can see that this is a budget summary sheet. It's not a ton of detail, but it gives you a ballpark that I need about $7,000 for supplies in year one. I'm going to need some other expenses, like I want to reimburse our teachers for participating until we get down to, let's see, how do I even? The bottom, which is I'm aiming to spend 100,000, and so far I'm over. I have 101,000, so I'm going to have to go back and cut some costs. So you'll see I have direct costs estimated at 92,000. This funder includes direct costs in their total allowed, which is 100. So we have 10% indirects at 9,000 and I'm over. So the accountant and I would have to go back and fix things until I can get it under 100,000. And the easiest way to do that is either eliminate a cost, reduce a trip, or decrease someone's salary. But I tend to not touch personnel. I want to keep that as flush as I can. Then at year two, you go through the same exercise. And this time you ask yourself, for each of your people, do you still need them to spend this amount of time? So you find that the leader of the project still needs a day a week. This person is staying the same. Professor 3, we now are asking her to do more things, so we've increased her time. If I remember correctly, we tried to get her all the way up to 10%, but in order to reach our budget, we had to go do something funky and end up at 8. But you can see how you're just constantly fiddling with the numbers until you can get to a plan that you can afford. If you needed to significantly cut people time, you'd have to go back to your grant and cut activities. You can't expect people to do more if you're not paying them a sufficient amount. Year two has similar amounts of travel and a little bit less on supplies, but spends more in personnel. And this happens a lot, where in year one, you just about buy everything. That's what this comment says below. Then Autism Speaks gave us a form and said, okay, we love getting your Excel spreadsheet. Now we want to see it in our form. And this is pretty common. So here you have what's referred to as a budget summary that goes in and for year one, year two, calculates all of the totals, calculates your directs and indirects, and magically ends up at our number, which is 200,000. Sorry, I don't know how to move this without messing with it. Okay, there we go. Now, you may ask, if the grant is offering 100,000 a year, wouldn't I be better off trying to uh, reduce my budget so the funder will be impressed that I'm only asking for 70? That's how I approached grantsmanship going in, and I got a lot of feedback. People said, always go for as much of the total amount offered as possible. And the reason for that is that things will happen across the course of your grant. And you don't want to do something unethical like padding, which would be adding an expense you don't really plan to use, but you do want to make sure that you have covered everything. So I will often include, for example, an additional hourly worker, because I've learned the hard way that I might have turnover, or maybe somebody will go on maternity leave and a grant still has to pay them for the leave, but I need the work done. So by adding an extra position, I'm making sure that I'll have the backup I need to run the project. If I get to the end of my project year and I have not spent all $100,000 that I asked for, there are two things that can happen. The first is that you alert the funder and you say, I have only spent 70,000. I'd like to formally request what's called a no cost extension. A no cost extension is you're asking them, can I have that 30,000 I didn't spend? Can you just push that into year two? and I will spend it then. That is a very important strategy to have in mind because many times things will happen in year one. Things might start slowly. Maybe you couldn't hire everybody on time and you've got some savings. If you don't request a no cost extension, or if it isn't allowed, then at the end of year one, the funder is just going to take that $30,000 back and you won't have a chance to repurpose it. If you still have to do the things that you needed that money for, that puts you in a disadvantage. So maintaining an eye on your budget across the year is really important, and then requesting permission to spend any unspent funds in year two is a very important thing. And the third thing I would want to tell you is that many times we will complete an entire grant. So the 2 years of this grant could be done, and I still have unspent money. You can request a no cost extension. Once again, it's not costing the funder anything more than they promised you already. But you are basically saying, I'm going to work a little longer on this project until I've spent all the money you've allowed me to spend. So no cost extensions are important to plan for. If they are not approved, then you just need to do what you can with the money that you've got. The one thing you don't want to do is spend money you don't have. So a big part of writing a grant is developing the budget, but a big part of managing the grant, which we're going to cover in the class towards the end of the semester, has to do with meeting with your financial person, maybe once a month, maybe once every other week, and reviewing all of your project budgets and making sure that you're doing okay, that you're following the rules and you have enough money, excuse me, to get you through. So any questions about that very brief overview of what goes into the spreadsheet and then eventually becomes the numbers that go to the grant? If so, you can put it in the chat or holler out. Now I just want to direct your attention to the budget justifications. So here's an example for the project I've been talking to you about. Usually in a budget justification, it's not counted in the page limits of the grant. So when you read a grant application, as you guys all did for the task analysis project, you probably noticed that you have to dig down there, but you'll find that they'll say you can only submit 80 pages of material, and it includes these things. Then they'll have a list of, we also want to have these items received from you, but we aren't counting them towards the page limits. That's where a lot of the financial documents come in. They don't want you to try to give them just a limited amount of info. So they aren't included in most page limits. So you want to tell them everything you can. Under key personnel, and I realize this is sort of dull and dry, but it's critical. This is the NIH format. You lead with the person. In the real world, it would be the person's name, because key personnel are people you usually have names for and you're providing brief bio sketches for so that the grant reviewers can see who these people are. But here I've protected anonymity. So Professor 1, who's a PhD, annual salary would be listed there with the hope that there's a raise. It's listed again for year 2. And then the role. This person is PI, spending 20% of their effort, requesting salary for 2.4 calendar months, which is just another way of saying 20% effort. Then it goes into that person's role, what they do for the organization broadly, and then goes into what they will do for this grant more specifically. And you do that for every key personnel on your project. And a great question just came in from Nikki. Can you request to spend money in a different way instead of an extension? Excellent question. Usually, yes. There are rules about it though. So like in an NIH grant, and this would include training grants, research grants, you're allowed to move money from one category to another as long as it is less than 25% of your total direct costs. So if you're getting to the end of year 1 and you haven't spent money on a statistician and you've got $14,000, which is less than 20%, you could decide, we could really use 2 more laptops. I'm going to move it into equipment, and I'm also going to purchase some more incentives for next year. It is a good idea to write to your program officer, whoever your contact is at the funder's office, and let them know that you are considering moving expenses from what we would say one line item, like a personnel cost, to another line item. Think of the word line item as meaning category. It's a good idea to tell them that in writing, even when the grant guidance says you can do it without permission at 20% or less. It's just a really good thing to keep that written record. If you have expenses that are more than the allowable amount, like 25% that you can move without permission, what you do is you write a formal letter asking for permission to move that larger amount of money and justify why it is you want to do it. So they're usually approved, but it's something you just have to be a really good communicator about. So for each of your key personnel, you're providing these little paragraphs. And as you may recall in module 4, we talked about writing about who you are. The grant reviewers are going to look at the bio sketches for these people, and they're going to look at the paragraph that describes what they're going to do for the project, and they might compare it to what you say in your budget justification. So your personnel narratives have to be all in sync. So as you can see, we do it for each of the personnel on this particular project. And then we have to also justify that we are adding fringe. Some groups don't, we always did. And then we go into this amount of detail on travel. So if we're planning a conference trip, you build in your airfare, your lodging. Per diem is basically the food per day, which is usually a rate determined by the institution that you work for. We also talk about travel. And in this case, I guess the rate was 50 cents a mile, which seems like a lot. And then describe why we need the supplies that we do. Now, we also included an incentive for our teachers, and I have found over time that funders really want detail on incentives. So that's why, you tend to see a reason for why you want the incentive, and then what it will cost in order to provide that. We also have to justify any printing, publication, tolls, or miscellaneous. Because Autism Speaks only gave a 10% indirect, they allowed us to spend money on printing and telephone. Other grants wouldn't have allowed that, but they would have paid a larger indirect. Then you do the same for year 2. And if it doesn't, really change, you can say that. But if you have any new expenses, you would say that. Okay. So in conclusion, stop the share. Budgeting is the kind of thing that you just kind of have to have a working vocabulary going into it. And I think it's a good idea to figure out who can help you in this process. So the first time that you develop a real budget for a real project, I'd recommend working with a mentor or working with a colleague who's done budgets before, and then, go in and talk to a financial person. So what kinds of questions or comments do you guys have about the fascinating topic of developing a budget? Somebody asked once, can I give myself a raise? And the answer to that is no. You can only put in a verifiable salary that you already have a contract for. Any other
I
questions?
just had a quick question about
Yeah.
the portion, the last couple slides that you were showing, like the
Mm-hmm.
little bio sketches.
Mm-hmm.
Do you normally write them up for the other personnel, or do you
Mm.
have like the potential personnel write them up themselves?
That's a great question, Jim. Early on, when I bring people onto a project, I will ask them for their bio sketch at the very beginning. We'll have a conversation together where I will talk to them about their role, what I'm thinking I will expect of them, get a sense of the kind of time they have, and we'll negotiate together before they formally join what that will be like. Then I'll ask them to write that section up for their role for the bio sketch and give it to me, I would say, within a couple of weeks of starting the grant process. Then I, as the PI, will go through all those bio sketches and make sure they line up with what I'm thinking. And then I will make sure that when I write the budget justification, it matches what the other team members and I put in place. The other thing that I would like to say is best practice, but I've never actually accomplished, is if you could get the grant done like a month in advance of the deadline, you would have time to send the bio sketches and the budget justification to every team member to review. But one of the things that we'll talk about in module 7 when we get into submitting is many times, let's say a grant is due July 1, If you're working for a university, they need 3 weeks in-house to process the grant. So already my real deadline is the second week of June. Then add that you might want feedback from your colleagues. Now you're talking about the first week of May. So it all depends on, where your timeline is on as to how much you can include other people. But if you are asked by somebody to give a bio sketch or help flesh out a role for a project, just try to keep in mind that person is probably managing lots of materials that are supposed to come in from lots of people. And the prompter you can be, the better. It's really hard to chase down busy colleagues for a bio sketch when time is of the essence. So good to do that up front, and then the PI makes sure it's consistent. Any other questions or comments? All right, very good. And I realize perhaps not the most compelling topic, but let me just orient you a little bit to some of the materials that I hope will help it make sense. I think of budgeting as something that get a general idea about it, but then you're really gonna learn by doing. So let me go back to screen sharing for a second. And under module 6, I just wanted to point out that I scanned and posted a reading that I thought was done pretty well for describing the big picture of budgeting. But then I also included 2 videos that are on the short side and I think really do a nice job of covering budgets in more depth, actually, the one from Penn State than I have today. If you are really interested in budgeting and would like to go more deeply, I would think of these as optional. I've posted 2 videos that are closer to an hour from the nonprofit context and the NIH context that absolutely cover every detail. In fact, this NIH one, I watched it prior to submitting a budget and it helped me a ton. So time well spent if you are currently working on a budget. It might be something to save for later if you're busy now. Then the other things I wanted to point out is we've got the educational identification that I just covered. Then I've included another example from public health, and then another one on the hypothetical example built on that Simpsons thing that your assignment is about, and then a couple of tools you might find useful. So the first is a spreadsheet built by a nonprofit leadership group as a kind of a template, and the second has to do with the NIH budgets. So take a look at the assignment. It basically involves brainstorming expenses. So it doesn't require a whole lot of math. I just want you to kind of get your hands on what the project might require and think through the expenses that you might need to run a project well. So as you might recall, we have an optional video conference on the 10th. That's next week, our very first optional one that will actually happen. So I will be here at 10. If you have any questions on budgeting, let me know.